Okay, hello everyone. Thank you very much for your patience while we ran through a few technical items before we got going this afternoon. And welcome to this webinar. My name is Scott Bellis. I'm a counselor for the BC Yukon region and your current council president. I've been a member of Equity since 1988. I'm also a lifelong resident of the Vancouver area, where I was born and raised on the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and in particular, the Musqueam First Nations. Musqueam people and other peoples of the Salish Sea have been making their homes along the Fraser River and the surrounding waters for thousands of years. Their care of the Great River and the lands around it are ongoing to this day. Okay, I'd like to read, before we get going, Equity's Statement of Affirmation, which is a statement that we read at all of our public events and member education sessions. It goes like this. Equity embraces an open and inclusive environment and encourages respectful behavior that affirms the dignity of all individuals. Equity further recognizes our shared responsibility for vigilance in creating and maintaining this environment. Equity recognizes a shared history with Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. In honor of those who have gone before us, Equity commits to working toward understanding and actionable practices of reconciliation. Thank you, and welcome everybody to this first in a whole series of workshops and forums on topics of great importance to the members. I'd like to acknowledge the Government of Canada for funding these programs. We got funding for this through the Department of Canadian Heritage as part of their Canada Performing Arts Workers Resilience Fund. We're going to open this series with part one of the Anti-Oppression Communications Workshop. Part two will follow early next year. Our commitment to take action on dismantling systems of oppression within our association and within our industry and our community has not wavered. We continue our racial justice work by examining systemic racism within workplaces and structures and how we can all work to change the existing systems of oppression, making them more equitable and accessible. We hope to receive your feedback and guidance as this work continues. Okay, as usual, if participants have a question about anything they see in the presentation today, we are encouraging you to use the raise hand option or put your question in the Q&A section. As if you put your question in the chat, it may get lost. However, if you have comments or answers to things that are asked throughout the presentation, please put those in the chat. So questions in the Q&A and comments in the chat. Thank you very much. Okay, so right now I would like to introduce to you Douglas Stewart. Douglas brings years of experience as an equity trainer and dispute resolution officer. His work now focuses in the field of human rights, diversity, cultural competence, and organizational change management, providing strategic planning, system reviews, process facilitation, and a whole range of professional development services. Douglas provides a lot of advice and expertise for us here at Equity, and we're very pleased to have him. I invite you to read more about Douglas at the link, which we will share in the chat. Okay, I will turn it over to you now, Douglas. Welcome. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Scott. And I just want to also appreciate all the folks like, Randy and Ilona, who have worked really hard with me to kind of prepare for the session and get these materials out to you. So hopefully everyone has the materials to follow along. And as you know, this is part one, and then we'll keep building on this with part two to keep moving this forward. And I noticed, I see that a hand was raised. So I don't know if what we're going to have is in the background, Scott, Randy, and Ilona will sort of respond to some of the chat requests, or so I see a hand raised, so I don't know if we want to leave some space for that person to say what they need.
That was an accident, Douglas.
Okay, no worries. Amanda, I did notice Amanda, by the way, also thanking Amanda and David as well, who are here supporting us with sign interpretation, ASL interpretation. And Amanda, I did see your hand raised. So I don't know if you wanted to say something. No, good. Okay. All right. So thank you, everyone. And so I'm going to move us in along. So just again, remind you of the objectives. You have this in your package. And so I always want to say it's to enhance, because I think many of you have been on this journey for a while. I see some familiar folks who have already said hello to me. So hello. And so really it's enhancing the way that we understand the dynamics and differential impact of systemic oppression in our workspaces. As Scott said, there's been an ongoing commitment by Equity to keep doing this work. And I joined the work with Equity quite a few years ago now. And so it's really about how do we continue to build that awareness and understanding. And then just to make sure that we're understanding concepts the same, because, you know, Equity has put quite a bit of material out that has information around these various words. And certainly there are many more, but just for today, in terms of the time we have, we'll cover some of these. So bias, microaggressions, power and privilege, impact versus intent, and certainly also, you know, various kinds of examples of oppressions that also exist, right? And particularly when we look at the cycle of how oppression works. And then really always your opportunity to reflect on your cultural competency in co-creating, because I think as Equity does these sessions is about how it invites and supports you know, membership participation. And there's a really good concept by many organizations you know, that they say, which is to not leave anybody behind, and to really recognize that people are always at different places in terms of our experience with these issues. Some are just entering it or don't have time to put a lot of energy or focus. Other people, it's our lived experience in very dynamic ways, ongoing, and other folks have made a point of really commitment and interest and engagement and studying around it. So to balance all of that, you know, in a co-creating space, we want to make sure we take the time, like these sessions, to make sure we build capacity for us to keep having a very cooperative kind of process and constructive process moving forward with each other as we do this work. And so the agenda, we will be going until 4 p.m. And you can see that, you know, it's a circle because it's rare that it's a linear conversation. A number of these will, like, you know, link with each other as we keep going through the conversation. So, but going to start with sort of the impact of oppression on communication in our workspaces. So just a reflection on that. And then looking specifically at some historical moments in Canada's you know, journey around this issue, because even myself as a newer immigrant in this country, I have been learning quite a lot in just the last few years, even as somebody doing this kind of work. And so I just want to make sure that we're also understanding what is the framework that, you know, contributes to what we experience in sometimes miscommunications, in terms of also the energy that for some people, incidents might seem really simple to some of us, how the weight of that for some folks, and just the idea of the kind of resonance that some of that history still has in a lot of the things that are happening around us. And it also helps us understand why, you know, the way oppression exists in our current society exists the way it does, right? And through that, we're going to move to look at actually the sort of a model, that cycle of oppression, and then some examples of some of the structural inequalities, some of which Equity has actually been chipping away at over the last little while. And so we'll give you at least one key example of that later on in the session. And then a chance for you sort of as a part of the wrap up for this session in a way to do some reflections on the impact of power and privilege. And that's where you got the handout, which is the abbreviated knapsack, and then also microaggressions, right? Just to look at some examples of that, how they still show up in our workspaces and the ways that we might need to think about working on them. And so did want to start in, and I'll just check because I do see that there's some notes in the chat if there's any question. Okay, that was that. Thank you. So I don't know if there's anything for folks to let me know about in the chat. Just checking in with Ilona, Scott, or Randy.
No, I think we're in good shape, Douglas. If anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A section. We'll be able to get to them. Okay, great. So this piece, cultural competency, did want to start by just saying that when we think, you know, the ask by Equity for me to look at communication quite specific, not just the larger issue of just how oppression works, but really specific communication, thought it was very important to really link that to this notion of what they call cultural competency. And some of you, I know when you hear that term, you can bristle a little bit because sometimes it's this idea that somehow you can ever learn to be culturally competent in every single, or competent culturally in every single moment, considering the diversity of so many cultures and the way culture is defined and the intersectionality. So it's really rare that anybody can ever be competent in every kind of cultural expression or experience, right?
but it actually is a way to kind of at least say that there are particular kinds of things to pay attention to in how we engage and how we build community with each other. And so one of them, as you can see here in this list, is communication, right? So it's really then thinking about how are we interacting across different cultural experiences, and that some of the components here presented are for just us starting with ourselves. How are we aware of our own experience of the world? And that shapes our cultural worldview. What it is in terms of our attitudes towards cultural difference, right? So how do we feel and think about other cultural experiences? And so do we have judgments about it? Do we see it as lesser than? Do we see it as distinctly different in ways that can also be stereotypical, for example? So not unpacking it enough to say that, well, it might be true for this one person, but it may not be true for another person. And even if, say, you come from a cultural experience that sorts of general definitions, there are lots of ways in which I'm sure many of you in this session right now have made decisions about how you are going to choose to live your life really differently. So somebody seeing you as, say, a part of your, say, biological family or the family that raised you or that nurtured you, that might see you and say, well, you're going to be like them in terms of the foods you eat, the religion that you practice, you know, the kinds of habits that you have. And you're thinking, well, the thing I've made my life's work to do is to be very distinct from that experience. And so that's true if you think of any groupings of people with a racially or bisexual orientation or gender identity or any of those things, right? So just to be mindful of how we're understanding that. And then our knowledge of different practices and worldviews. So even what we are aware of in terms of the potential for different ways for people to think about things or live their lives. And then, of course, then having the skills. What are the skills to do this? And so we would say that today, some of what we're doing is try to build some of those skills around how we sort of work through, you know, recognize our own worldview, what our attitudes are around that, what we actually know about those different ways and experiences, and particularly today, looking at a framework, right, for, you know, unpacking what are some of the historical legacies and the ways in which that can show up in very oppressive ways, or particularly people can experience oppression because of those identifications or ways of being in the world. And so one of the things we think is really important then is to develop, you know, certain kinds of cultural competence. That means that then we're able to understand and communicate with and effectively interact with people across cultures, right? So it's just that notion that it's about the way we get to that is by really doing some of that work that unpacks some of that ways that we're living with our own understanding, our own attitudes about people, our own knowledge, and then the skills that we need to develop to actually do this as keep progressing in ways to do this more effectively. And so then to speak about communication, then we want to be clear about what it means. And so you can see the definition here, and hopefully you also have it in your package. And so communication is the activity of conveying meaningful information. It requires a sender, and of course, something that you're saying, so a message, and then a recipient, somebody who's going to receive that information, right? And so although the receiver need not always be present, because, you know, in different ways now we are maybe sharing information with someone else who will let them know, or, you know, we're now living with sort of, you know, email, text, virtual experiences of how we do some of these pieces. And so it is about just being mindful of how that mix again of intent versus impact. And I always think of when I get an email and if things are in capitals or bolded, how I'm getting a sense that people are shouting at me, right? And so the use of certain words or language, so if something is really abrupt or brief, I might have a reaction to that versus if somebody takes some time to explain. And so it's really about how all of this exists, you know, across vast distances in time and space, based on the time we receive the information, what has happened in between the time the person has sent that information and we receive it, right? And that this process is complete once the receiver has understood the sender. So think of the times when you've received an email or a message or in a conversation and it takes you a while to say, wait a minute, am I understanding what you're saying? Or we go to our own conclusion, right? We fill in the blanks. And so some of the work today really in this session is to think about the ways that we sometimes do fill in those blanks, either based on our own journey with understanding an issue, you know, as well as what we interpret something to mean when we receive it, until we're able to actually have the clarifying conversation. And one of the things that in my work of dispute resolution that I've had to work with is to help that process. And so one of the things as we're having this conversation is to remember equity's role certainly as a resource to consult with at times when maybe there is that miscommunication, or you're left with a message or a feeling that is not consistent with equity's values or expectations for how you should experience, you know, the industry, or the workspaces that you're in, right? So yes, we're building some capacity for how we do this with each other, but there's also times when that you may need that support and resource. So to always say that we understand that these are multiple things that need to support each other over time. So I'm gonna then start with the scenario with you, right? And share this with you. And you'll see the question at the bottom. So after I read the scenario through, going to ask if you can in the chat, put some feedback or responses to this question with the scenario. And the question is, what are the issues that you think are impacting communication or resolution in this scenario, right? And so the scenario, I'll just read it through, basically reads, you are in a touring production with a group of male cast members who insist on being the only ones to drive the van, always deciding when and where stops are made and where to eat. Every scene pitched or every improv scene they initiate makes the women strippers, secretaries, or stay-at-home wives. When you speak with the director, who responds, well, yes, we have a couple of alpha-type bro-y personalities in our cast. We knew that when we cast them, but that's what makes them funny. The director, who you experience as trying to be one of the boys and bros, along with the male cast members, also often make statements like, well, you're the low man on the totem pole, so don't be an Indian giver, when your cast members resist taking on the undesirable roles. So hopefully, and yes, and you have the scenario as well, so hopefully you're able to also read along. And so the question is, what are the issues that are impacting communication and resolution in this scenario? So if you can just put that in the chat, that would be really great. So any thoughts or feedback that you have? Don't overthink this, just whatever comes to mind. When you think about if I'm going to try to talk about this or what's impacting my even thinking about talking about this, maybe even my hesitancy about talking about this. And then if I talked about this, and try to resolve it, what might impact, what will either help or hinder how I'm able to do that. So just some of those kinds of thoughts. I'll give you a few minutes, couple of minutes. And I think eventually Ilona will read a few of those out so we can hear them. And so maybe Ilona, if you can start giving us some examples of what we're
Yeah, actually, I'll do that, Douglas.
okay,
Yeah. So I'm seeing a lot of comments about sexism, racism. The one that's jumping really out for me is comments about power imbalance and power structures, because those kinds of imbalances, I guess, tend to lead to behavior on oppressive behavior or wrongful behavior in all kinds of different directions.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any others you want to, I know you're probably just as it's spoken.
There's some things about, what is the engagers or what's the producer's responsibility in there as well? Where's the leadership?
Great. And what we've said for folks who are on is that, we'll probably copy some of the chat to make sure that we can keep some of this information as ways that even in the Q&A, when you ask questions, if there's some things left over that we don't get to, that maybe there could be some follow-up. And certainly for me, as well as doing a second session, I'd be able to look at anything that we missed or that we could pick up on to keep having the conversation moving forward. So thank you for your responses to that. And so one of the things then, I just want to give you this framework, and I think I sent this out ahead, and if not, we'll make sure anything that we didn't send you that we think will be useful for you to have, we'll certainly follow up with. And so when we think about anti-oppressive communication, and I think I'm hearing Scott sharing that there are a number of things that you're raising which are great examples, right? And one of the big things is also that piece of, so when this environment was created, was there a check-in, right? Is that first day talk, for example, right? Was there actually a review of sort of what are the guidelines, the principles, the agreements, and ground rules for how we're going to work together, right? And how do we name and talk about the way that potentially oppressive behavior might occur, and just to take that time to engage around. And then, so what are the expectations, right? And then, as you can see in this framework, it's to look at, well, starting with also who is in the environment. And I think it's to think about, and even what are the assumptions about who's in the environment. And you can see the list there in terms of, different criteria here, right? So race, gender, age, ethnicity, physical considerations, religion, sexual orientation, among a number of things. Because as in the scenario dynamic is happening, there are people being affected. So, people are being targeted or being affected and impacted significantly by what's going on and being rendered vulnerable and at risk. And then there are folks who then are maybe one would argue that sometimes unintentionally, exercising their power, partly because, as I often say to folks, I'm still on a journey where I don't know what I don't know till I know I didn't know it, right? Or I've also lived with certain privileges that I'm not always self-aware as much of how I have those privileges until it's pointed out to me, or I have to do the work about it, right? Of course, there's also another argument that some of us are intentionally still leveraging our privileges in ways that are oppressive to others, partly because of maybe the values and the belief systems that we might have. And that moves to the top right hand where you see what we've learned, right? So again, our educational background, work experience. And I think some of you are also speaking to the idea of the industry. What has been the industry messaging? And so that's been the work of equity to try to really make sure that clearer messages are in the environment about what is the kinds of workspaces and workplaces that we want to have. And also even things like thinking about what is the model for getting at good performance, right? What is the model for what it means to, inspire those performances or create a sort of environment that will lead to really great performance? And many of you on this know that there's been all kinds of biased ideas about what that would look like, including some of what's been expressed in this scenario around a sort of bullying environment, or the other thing is about what it means to take risks and what's risky, right? But then even those conversations have been fraught with inequities at whose expense, right? And who has to then adjust to, and whose power and privilege is constantly being perpetuated by that, right? And so you see some other things, their beliefs, family situation, geographic background, job assignments, right? So again, power roles, right? Who should be intervening? Who should be saying something? And then if the person in power is not intervening and seeming to go along, oh, so maybe that is the culture we're in. And if I go against that, how vulnerable will I be? One, to have a positive experience in this environment, but two, potentially keep my job, right? And some of the history here of this work has been people have been hesitant because of fear of reprisal, meaning I'm punished or penalized for speaking up or saying anything, or their experience is compromised by making them even wonder about themselves, self-selecting out of the industry, right? So, and then how we interact, as you can see, the bottom right. So, again, you're talking about accountability. So who's what's the behavior expected? Who should intervene? What should be the role to hold people accountable? And then appreciation, respect, empowerment. So how do we make sure people are aware of their right to speak up, to challenge without fear of repercussion? And then teamwork, openness. I mean, you see that list there: positive change, flexibility, opportunity, inclusion, work-life balance, community, business, outreach, right? And then really importantly, on the bottom left, you have how we lead. And that's for any of you who are, say, equity liaison roles, you are stage managers, you're the director, or you might even be a producer, or in a role where ultimately other people are looking to you to set the stage, the environment, to message the expectations, but also to reinforce accountability, but also support ongoing learning by building healthy environments for engagement that shouldn't stifle, of course, which some of us are worried about. Oh, is it going to get very sterile and we don't have the dynamic that really encourages great, art and great creativity? And that's hopefully not what you're hearing that this is about. It's about how we're mindful about the other dynamics that are at play, which doesn't mean we can't open a space to sometimes take some risk, knowing that we've got to also have the conversation about what does that mean? How does that impact? And I think we're seeing some really great work being created now based on that kind of dynamic being engaged in all kinds of environments. So it's just about us starting to be open to what that looks like and being innovative. And, as I work with many industries outside of the performing arts industry, people are saying that they're, just to give you an example, I work with a community services agency. They've got a dynamic between the union and leadership, so labor and managers. And one of the things that they've suddenly begun to talk about when they're doing their negotiations for their collective agreement or their bargaining is, what they call the art of the possible. And so they've begun to think about, does it have to be, adversarial? Is there ways that we can meet in different ways or think of different frameworks for having that conversation that opens up more possibility for equity? So lots of different things and ideas and ways of thinking about how we enhance how we're talking to each other, engaging with each other to create the kinds of environment that we're looking forward to.
Douglas, before we move on, there's a question.
Mm-hmm.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, go ahead.
So the question is, would we say that a communication process is not complete when we have interpreted rather than understood the message?
I would agree with that, right? And it's going back to this definition, right? So it says the communication process can be once we understood the sender, right? And exactly. So you've really captured that last sentence really well. And that's what I was explaining, that, sometimes then we have to pause. And that's the difficulty I know in lots of workplaces that I'm supporting, is people are pressed. There's a time pressure. We're opening in a few weeks, right? We still got so much to do. And so how much time can we take doing this work when we've got to get what we see as the main focus done? And this is where I know, as I've worked with the industry, I've heard the folks who are struggling a little bit with all of this to say, it sounds like it's sort of getting in the way of just getting things done or getting them done in a particular kind of way. But to your point, exactly, if there is that rush sometimes, or those miscommunications, which have been historic, not stopping and saying, wait a minute, I'm not sure I understand that, or I'm clear about that, or here is what I'm thinking you're saying or meaning or assuming, and it gives a chance for that pause, for that clarification to happen, right? So that there's a clear understanding. It's kind of like when you've heard the saying, it's important to stop and think about when somebody's communicating with us, particularly if they're trying to get a message to us, are we, or in dialogue particularly, are we listening to respond or listening to understand? And I know, if I'm honest, I'm somebody who regularly is listening to respond, because as they're talking, I'm constructing in my, as they're talking or signing or however they're communicating with me, in my head, I'm creating and constructing my response. So I'm actually missing sometimes what they're saying. And some of this is also driven by our interests, right? If we've got a certain position or an interest or an idea about something, which I know I do and I hold very strongly, and I anticipate that whatever's coming at me might challenge that, it's rare that I'm really being open to hearing what else should I be considering or understanding before I'm ready with a response. So I would agree with what the person wrote. Is that making sense to the questioner, person who asked the question?
Thank you, Douglas.
Okay, I'll keep moving. And yes, please, so we'll entertain those questions, even as we will probably leave some time at the end. So I'm going to ask you to take some time, and the question simply here is, are you able to read and understand this text? So let's take a moment. And then if you are, just put in the chat yes or no, or any other nuance to your engagement with this text. Okay, and as I'm seeing a lot, actually just quickly chat myself, and I'm seeing a lot of yeses. And so the question I have to ask is a follow-up. And let me just name and acknowledge that for folks who have, say, a learning disability, or for example, people have looked at and said, wait a minute, I have dyslexia, I don't know how you expect me to read that, or other folks. So this is very much so geared towards the idea of sort of able-bodiedness in terms of how we learn or communicate. So I just want to acknowledge that up front, that this does not always work. So let's be mindful even in this moment of even those of us who are able learning ability privileges, right? In terms of how the usual methods of communication are constructed, how we can engage and go, right, yeah, things that have been designed for me in a particular way mean that I can engage with this, right? So then the question that I'm going to ask, so outside of that, why do you think you're able to read this text even though it's jumbled? Any thoughts or reflections? Oh, sorry, Heather, thank you, Heather. Thank you for saying that. Heather has put in the chat, it is super easy for dyslexics. So that's, I'm learning in the moment. And I don't know if Heather wants to add a little bit more why. Heather D. Swain. Ah, Valerie, this is the way I often see the text. Okay. Thank you, Heather. So you've had to do that work, in a more conscious way. Like I have to be prepared to pay attention to how I'm learning and how I'm reading. Ah, I see. So you're kind of, thank you. That helps to answer the question. So that's a learning from me today and how I present this, right? That you're able to answer the question, which is, what studies show is that once the first letter and the last letter in the right order, we do a lot of filling in, right? And I'm seeing here how the brain codes language, context. Ah, great. So you're leaning into it. I mean, the other thing that I would add here, just that fits with our conversation around, anti-oppression, is that just to be mindful that the same way you were able to just do this is that a lot of the rest of our lives are like that in terms of what, as somebody said, the context, what we've learned, how we are able to put things together so that we start to make sense of things in particular kinds of ways, right? And so much more. And thank you. There's so much wonderful things being put in the chat as well that are fit with this. So think about this in the context of then also, and I'm going to shift then to another definition here, which is bias, right? How bias works, right? And what you just did, that little exercise, is an example of kind of how bias works, how many things that are in our life's journey and the way we've learned things and taught things in the concepts of society, have helped to sort of shape a way that we'll respond to something initially, right? And so, we talk about it in two ways: explicitly, so we're very conscious about, that bias that we carry, or implicitly, where we don't necessarily notice or recognize it, but it's still occurring, even when we don't mean to be doing that, right? And so I know for myself, for example, I think I'm a good guy trying to be on a journey of unpacking, issues and doing my own self-reflection work. But on occasion, I will be given feedback by someone that a way that I looked at something and the way I perceived it, is biased, or I've made a judgment unfairly, or even my actions suggested that I'm going down a path based on some assumption or ideas about a group of people, right? I mean, one could even argue of just what I just said earlier about, how dyslexic folks would look at this material, only to be correct to say, wait a minute, yes, the usual idea is that, the way things are around us doesn't work for some folks, but the possibility is that in this moment, actually, it does work for someone. So again, I go back to the thing I said about, you don't know what you don't know until you know you didn't know it. And so that's a really good example of how we think about that. And so why I'm talking about this in terms of communication is, one, you can see just straightforward about how it might, interrupt or interfere with then clear communication and clear understanding with each other, but also quite specifically, if I just go to the next slide, when we start to now look at history, and history's impact in shaping our communication and shaping our world around us, think of the kinds of things that we've learned or sometimes not learned to really understand that might be impacting how people are understanding us and how we might also be understanding them and perceiving them as well, right? And so how that can compromise our communication with each other. So you'll see on this slide, as I move into this piece, and sorry, let me just pause here for a second and just see, before I move to this piece, if there's any questions about, or other comments on this or on the bias piece I just did. So again, in the chat, you can put any information or any feedback. And again, I like to check in with folks because, usually when I'm in a session and I can see everybody, I go, is this making sense? Isn't it not? Do you have any clarifications? Just so, I'm not just talking at you and you're sitting there going, wait a minute, I'm not getting that. So let me know in the chat is it making sense? Is it lining up? Is it landing? Or if there's any questions, again, in the Q&A or in the chat. Sorry, I won't, in the Q&A, if you have questions or any other comments in the chat. Okay, all right, I'm seeing a couple of folks, so I'm going to keep going. So this piece then is, I included this because I think it's so important that I find sometimes when I'm in, engagements with folks, if I, don't always understand what shaped their worldview, it starts to affect sort of our communication and our dynamic. And I'll give you a concrete example. Many, many years ago, I remember when it was going to turn 2000. And I don't know if folks, who've been around for a while, remember those times when we were worried about Y2K and what was going to happen. Was the world going to explode, fall apart? But it was also a significant celebration. And I remember I was with a colleague of mine at the time, and I kept saying to them, I think some friends and I were actually going to go to the South for a vacation and make sure we were on the beach. At the time, the clock struck midnight, right? December 31st, 1999. And so it was a big hoopla about it. And I kept saying to her, isn't that a big deal? And then she looked at me and she said, and she was a little bit low key, and I didn't understand why. And then finally, at one point, she said, Douglas, I celebrate a very different calendar. It doesn't resonate the same way for me. And I'm excited for you because, yes, I've had to adjust and live in a world where that's the Judeo-Christian, the Christian calendar is the one that you follow, but it's not the one that I follow. And so it was a moment of my just taking pause, that I was just running off with the assumption that everyone around me lives in the world the same way. This would have meaning for them? And it did for a lot, but I had not left space that's not necessarily true for a number of folks. And so it was a moment of just learning and understanding that was a different experience for her, right? So, and this is where you could also get into certain kinds of issues with folks when, because she certainly was affected by my enthusiasm, which left no space for her own experience to say that, we could meet at the table. And what I was doing was reinforcing a consistent experience in her life, right, in terms of how the world is constructed. And so what I look at when I look at these four squares, the top left, and some of you might recognize some of these already, is during the Second World War, when the Japanese families were rounded up here and in the States and interned in camps, literally asked to basically gather their belongings, which couldn't be very much. And they were put in camps, partly because they were seen as a security threat because of the Japanese role or Japan, let me be very specific, Japan's role in the Second World War, right? Or during the Second World War. And the real issue, one of the issues still, is that when those folks were, released from those camps, they rarely, if ever, were given their properties back that they had worked very hard to build. And so they had to start from scratch. The top right-hand corner, you'll see an image, which sometimes people think it's from a residential school. And I always say that's not necessarily so far off, but it is actually an image from a segregated Black school here in this part of the country in Southern Ontario, because I'm based in Toronto, in Ontario. And so that image then is of a school, which was really almost a separate school system that not that the government created, but that benevolent societies or Black church groups or other communities, Black communities created to make sure Black children could go to school, could get educated. And what I should say, why I say it's not so far from a residential school, is that many of those people were also multiracial. They were both Indigenous and Black as well, as you might find in lots of residential Indigenous communities right now, that many folks identify multiracially. Certainly, have Métis folks, but you also have a high percentage of folks who also identify as Black and Indigenous. And so similarly to the, having a separate school system, these systems were there until, the mainstream system, which didn't allow non-white students to eventually attend those systems. So just that's a part of the legacy in Canada, right? If you want to know more about some of that legal history, there is, I'll put in the chat in a little bit. In fact, I'll see if I can do it now. There's a woman named Constance Backhouse, and I'll write it so that Randy and Ilona and Scott can see it. Constance Backhouse. And if you put in the main chat, Constance Backhouse, she has a website, which is actually constancebackhouse.com. And she has a really good book that is called, Color Coded. And it's about the legal history of racism in this country. So different times, key cases where the government basically implemented racist policies in this country. And certainly the education system would have been one of them. And that's just, I think she quotes 6 key cases of so many others over the course of this country's history. And so also you'll see at the very bottom left, there is an image, and that image is from a ship called the Komagata Maru, that was sitting in the Vancouver Harbor for about a few weeks, where they weren't allowed to offboard, and was carrying a group of Sikh immigrants, mostly men from India, and they weren't allowed to offboard because Canada at that time had implemented what they called a continuous journey law. And the continuous journey law was such that you had to, if you're landing in a Canadian port, wherever your point of origin you were coming from, you should not have stopped anywhere along the way, which was difficult when you were coming from somewhere like India back in those times, because at some point you'd have to stop somewhere to refuel or to get fresh produce for the health of your passengers. And so this ship also had to do that. And so when it got to the harbor, they weren't allowed to offboard as a result. And you'll see there are videos and films of the moment or along the shores, and you'll see people holding signs saying, "Keep Canada white," right? And because part of why even the continuous journey law was put in place was whenever there was a potential for new migration into this country, there was a response or reaction of anxiety about the changing whiteness of Canada. And when I say whiteness, it's really important to understand in the history of Turtle Island, as Indigenous people used to call this landscape, that, particularly the English, were very anxious about maintaining a purist idea of whiteness. And whiteness was only folks who were English, not even Irish, Scottish, or Welsh were considered white initially, as other Southern Europeans who eventually came. And that's why you would have seen in the history of this country, there were signs in places that said no, while it said no blacks, it also said no Irish at times. It also said, and see some people are adding in the chat, no Italian, Spanish. There were lots of different, and including then they would also add no dogs, right? And so just to be really, really clear about this journey that we're on, we currently, of course, understand that whiteness has now been sort of assigned and to people who are of Caucasian origin or are presenting in a way that means that some of those kinds of barriers are no longer the same experience. But it's just to make sure that make a connection to that history that is similar to, in many ways, back in those past times, to what is happening to racialized people continually in our current culture, right? And if people remember the potato famine and the loss of even some of the Gaelic languages in Wales particularly, but also in Ireland, that's similar to what we see happening to Indigenous people in this part of the world, that early, kind of colonization by the English across the United Kingdom and what we now call Britain had its own impact. And one of the things to think about, even in Canada, is why is it that the only region in this country that there are jokes about, if you think about why we have Newfie jokes, right, that there's a history there of who larger populations of Irish, Scots and, Welsh folks who settled in those parts of the world of this country, as well as, Cape Breton, New Brunswick. Just think of that. And of course, many of you probably have heritage from that time and probably have heard the stories about the difficulty of folks coming to, east, sort of west in Canada, the difficulty of finding work because of the way you sounded. And again, the jokes that continue to proliferate, or I think I hear less of them now, but the fact that we even have that heritage in a way that we don't have about anywhere else in this country. Yes, there are little jokes about Southern Ontario and Toronto and, different parts, but nothing as systemically impactful as the jokes that were there about Newfoundland, folks from Newfoundland, and that have had searing impact, right? So just to make those connections that when we talk about the history of, difference, oppression, there is a connection that must be acknowledged. And then, of course, you have the experience, actually was just in Quebec part of this weekend, of just the impact for French and French folks across this country, right? And that continuing conversation that we have about being a bilingual country and all. And frankly, yes, here I am presenting in English. And, I was in Quebec lamenting the fact that I didn't have the same impetus, which is really English is my first language, my privilege, but also a certain kind of entitlement that in the context of this part of the country, this country, but also when I move around the world, right, that so many things work for me. So English is a very privileged language, and that creates a sort of entitled experience. In many ways, that entitlement gets created around race, around sexual orientation, around class, and we could go down the list, hopefully. Just to give you sort of that framework. The one other thing I'd also share with you is that, I don't know if people know about a ship called the St. Louis. And the St. Louis was a ship that had been given rite of passage to go to Cuba with a group of German immigrants who were Jewish, as a way of escaping what was coming in, the Nazi, terrorizing of the Jewish people in that part of the world. And unfortunately, when the ship got to Cuba, Cuba reneged on its promise to have them land. And they spent a few weeks moving around the Atlantic, trying to settle either in the United States or in Canada, and neither country would allow them. And so they ended up actually having to go back to Germany, where many of them died in concentration camps. Just to say with you that the Komagata-Maru folks as well had to go back to India. And when they got back there, because there was suspicions about why they had to return and weren't allowed to stay in Canada, they were also persecuted. Many of them ended up being killed as well, because folks thought that they may have brought back disease or that they were undesirables for various reasons and ways. And so the thing that people may not know, and I know this a little bit in addition to the work I've done around doing these trainings, but I had to do a research project at one time in my early years of doing this work. And I learned that at the time of the Second World War, during the Nazi occupation of Germany and the persecution of Jewish folks, that at that time, many more people who were non-Jewish were allowed to migrate to Canada from Germany at a time when very few, if any, Jewish people were allowed to migrate. And just because Canada had this idea about wanting to keep this country pure, or as close to what they see as compatible with a sort of Anglo, Catholic or Protestant, religious practice. And so anything else was seen as othered and was suppressed, or, there was lots of suspicion about having those folks enter the country. And I could go on with this, but I'm going to move us on, because there's also the Chinese head tax, which is something that also came about when, many Chinese families, men particularly, single men, but also some women who came, wanted to then bring their families to join them. And then that was put in place because of the same anxiety. And as a result, many people did not get, reunited with their families for many decades. And then you should know that at the same time, Canada had what they called, miscegenation sort of law or policy, which required that then, racialized men would not intermarry with white women. So as a result, in terms of access, where racialized people could not meet other racialized folks, many of them basically were single and really were alone and lonely. And there's lots of actually stories and documentaries about some of this that you can also explore beyond this. But I just wanted to share that with you, just so that we understand that, there's an idea of Canada, and particularly in relation to the United States, around these issues that I don't know that folks have been as clear about, historically, as we've been in the last few years. People hopefully have heard of the doctrine of discovery. And the doctrine of discovery was something that you began to hear more about when the Pope recently came to Canada on his, I call it the apology tour, for, the death of Indigenous folks, across this country, but also what happened in the residential school system, and where we also still see a lot of missing and murdered Indigenous women in this country, where the same kind of vigilant follow-up to really find out what's happened and what's going on with them is not the same. And what we know is that some of this legacy is connected to what we call the Indian Act. And the Indian Act is certainly connected to the idea of the doctrine of discovery, which, for those of you who don't know what it is basically a policy that the Catholic Church co-signed that really allowed colonizers, sort of on the basis that they were doing good when they went to other parts of the world, to bring religion, to bring a sort of like preferred way of life to those parts of the world. And if people resisted, then it was sort of, folks were given carte blanche without any sort of religious sort of consequence to do whatever they wanted with those folks, right? And so as a result, you see this all around the world, in the global South particularly, and the global East, with the kinds of policies that were put in place that replaced people's cultures, that had lots of judgment about the values and the ways that folks lived, and certainly led to lots of traumatic experiences for those various communities. Right? So again, just want to check, because I did quite a bit there. Any making sense?
Douglas, it's Scott. I just wanted to pick up a comment from Rita Deverell here in the chat about an assumption that if you've experienced one form of oppression, then you understand everything about all forms of oppression. I think her point is that this is a falsehood. How do we, how do we grasp all the different lines of oppression that exist in our society? Do you have a response to that statement?
But I think what Rita is saying is exactly spot on, which is the experience that people have, because what sometimes happens, and in fact, there is a scenario that we're going to use in the second session. We've got a few scenarios set up for that, which is exactly that, where someone assumes that because they understand or have experienced one form of oppression, then they get it for everyone else. Or more often is that they cannot be held as accountable in the same way. Right. So, the experience is certainly when someone may be caught or given feedback that their position, and so maybe if I give a concrete example, so there's something called misogynoir, right? I don't know if people have ever heard the term. So misogynoir, and it's basically where, for example, there's what we call appropriation, right? And one of the ways that you see this, for example, in queer communities is gay men will take on lots of what is often stereotypically seen as a certain kinds of ways that Black culture and Black women, and then particularly if you intersectionalize the queer community, Black gay men might express themselves, right? And so when you hear terms that we now take for granted, like reading, right, or throwing shade, that you see widely adopted all across all kinds of cultures now, particularly if you watch the Housewives franchise, or you're seeing it being picked up in culture, right? I mean, and there's precedent set before where, the first word is misogynoir. Maybe I'll see if I'll get the right, misogynoir. This might be a wrong spelling, but it's something like that in the moment, misogynoir. The one before shade, reading. So reading, when people are reading someone, right? And now this would be a whole other workshop that I would get into, but some of this you can explore a little bit more. But reading basically is, kind of to tell someone off, but in a very sort of underhanded way that they almost don't know that you're telling them off, and to show shade, and I might be mixing those up, but I just want to make the point that, kind of like how in general queer community, there was something back in the called camp, to sort of be campy. And any of you, there was a big fashion exhibition recently, the Met, I think a few years ago, which was all about camp. And this whole idea of how you certainly would look at culture and you have different references and ways of talking about it without it being so explicit, right, in how you engage about it, right? So misogynoir, sorry, Kimberly, yeah, we'll just keep following up. I know I'm throwing some things just to give the example of, but these kinds of behaviors get adopted in all kinds of ways and in all kinds of contexts that sometimes get thrown back at a community of where it originates. And so when people are very much held accountable for either appropriating or using those terms out of context or in particular ways, and it's seen as actually then oppressive, then the reaction is, well, how can I be seen as oppressive because I also experience oppression, right? Or I understand oppression in a particular way. And I think, Rita's point is that, yes, you can understand your own oppression, but it doesn't make you ultimately, not accountable for the ways that you might also oppress others. Partly because I would say we're all, a friend of mine calls it, we're swimming in the stew of the history that we're just talking about now. And some of it has stuck on a number of us. And so there's a ways in which, even when we may not intend or mean to be, we might be acting that out. And I would say, if I use myself as an example, as a Black man that certainly experiences racism and understands it, as a queer man that, as at the intersection as also as a Black queer man, lots of ways that I understand that. But I am also a cisgendered male. As I said earlier, my first language is English. And there are ways, and I'm able-bodied, certainly. And so there are ways in which there are things that I don't always understand or get. And I might also be still following the same path of, oppressive either language, behaviors, engagements that certainly I need to recognize. So it's really just about being self-aware. And I mean, the thing I'd always say is, if I give a simple way of saying it, is when I hear people say to me, oh, I'm not racist. And I always go, wow, listen, if you are, great, but I'd love to know what water you're drinking, because I'm trying so hard not to be all these things. But all I can say is that I'm a work in progress. I keep working on it. But part of my staying open is that it might be that there's something I don't know I'm doing or saying that might also impact people. So it just keeps me humble in terms of being available to hear feedback, that might make me have to think about something in a way that I'm doing something that is not my intent to harm, but might be having the impact of harm. Is that making sense to folks? I have to tell you,
Thanks for picking that up, Douglas. Thank you very much.
Great. I have to tell you, the reason why I'm not a fan of virtual, and I can't wait to go back into rooms and spaces with people, even though I think this works for when you're working with people across the country, is it's great when you can see people and engage with them. But anyway, thank you. I'm seeing some feedback. Thank you. And thank you, Scott, for picking that up. So I'm going to keep us moving. So going to show you a little clip, and this again might keep helping, because of course what we're talking about is building this towards kind of like, so what does this mean then for communication? That's why the second session will be much more practical, more scenarios, more conversations about how we build skills to do this and pick up all of this. So I'm going to show you, stop share right here, and I'm going to show you a clip about a series that was done to actually look at how Indigenous people were depicted in terms of, being profiled in terms of crime and seen when we think about criminality, for example. I'm going to stop share, go to the video, and then share again.
This is the case of the Indigenous Canadian crime film. Frozen Justice is an online educational video series that examines film and TV to help understand where ideas about crime and justice originate. Professor Stephen Combe is a criminology professor at the University of Winnipeg who started the series along with colleagues outside criminology. Combe believes films, while understudied, allow audiences to form opinions on right and wrong.
It's the place where common sense is created. So people watch a film about crime and justice and they form their ideas about what is good and bad and right is wrong. So there's a reason why crime films are so popular. It's because they communicate something really important to audiences about right and wrong, morality and immorality, justice and injustice. And those are powerful ideas.
In the second season, Combe looks at Indigenous people and the way they are depicted in certain crime films.
What we found is that there's literally hundreds of films that have come out of Hollywood that depict the Mounties and the great Canadian frontier, and it was no surprise that Indigenous peoples were almost invisible in those films, and if they did appear, they were almost just background characters.
Colleen Greenhill is also a part of the research team and hopes the educational series can spark a discussion about crime in Canada and crime involving Indigenous people.
But I think, for example, that a lot of the videos that we have created in Frozen Justice, both 1 and 2, can be used in educational settings. So not just university classes, but also public school, particularly high school, but public school in general.
Rebecca Gibson is the head of development at Eagle Vision. She believes having more Indigenous filmmakers is helping change public perspectives.
And it's interesting to see the perspective of the changes that have happened with films that involve Indigenous characters and Indigenous storylines, and how as more Indigenous people get involved in the storytelling and the filmmaking and in the acting, the stories are becoming better.
The Frozen Justice web series won't continue after this season, but both the professors and Eagle Vision hope to collaborate on more projects in the future. Daryl Stranger, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
These colonial myths by placing in
So let's just leave a bit of space for any comments in the chat about the video. So, and sorry, yeah, apologies to the interpreters. Yes, for some reason the closed captioning wasn't working on that video for some reason. I actually was trying to click on it and it wasn't coming up. So apologies. I think the rest should, and so we'll fix that for the next time as well. So apologies for that. So any comments in the chat about the video that you saw? Good question, Kimberly. I'm not sure. So Kimberly's asking, are all the participants in the research team white? No Indigenous folks, and good question. I'm actually not sure. But it'd be interesting to do a follow-up to actually explore that, to find out. Thank you, Kimberly. Yeah, it's a good, well, and you're raising something really important as we're creating the work, or we're doing the work. And I think it is a conversation many of us are having about what does it mean for us to play a role in certainly shifting the landscape. And, and of course, there's also that tension of, not always putting the weight on the folks who are the targets of oppression to us be the ones to do the work, right? And so then what does it look like to build those sort of partnerships and those kinds of solidarities? People are getting a bit wary of the word ally because it can get very kind of tokenistic, and so really importantly, I think what you're also raising and flagging is even when we talk about the, when we do land acknowledgements, it's really critical. Well, what is the other work we're doing as, entities or organizations or individuals to really shift the landscape? If you think about the land back movement, because the thing that some of my indigenous friends always say is, oh yeah, great that you're doing land acknowledgements. And don't get me wrong, I think people feel that there is a place for that, but what else is actually happening to make that have real meaning, right? And so, their thing is we need to really look at where the treaty agreements or treaties that were established are still not being honored, but also really have a more frank conversation about what does it mean for our different entities to show up in ways that are really meeting the expectations of the truth and reconciliation process, so that we really are telling truths, which is some of what we're doing here with these sessions, but also what does reconciliation look like and on whose terms, and how are Indigenous people part of this continuing telling the story, as well as, the kind of justice that they're seeking in terms of so many things that need to shift and change. So any other comments? Because I might be missing some. So Scott, let me know if I've missed anything or.
Yes, I will, Douglas. Thank you.
Okay, gonna keep us moving along. And so I'm gonna show you a few more clips, and I will make sure so there's a definition here that we sent in your package as well, so that you have that. Again, I'm going to move us along, but just always that's mindfulness that as we're looking and talking about this content, really be clear about, do we have common language for how we're understanding this? And hopefully, as we talked a bit about the doctrine of discovery, we can certainly see the ways that it certainly impact the differential experience for Indigenous people in this country. And so this is another video clip I'm going to show you, and it's from a series called Living in Color. And it talks a bit about anti-Black racism, so the underpinnings of that in Canada quite specifically. So I'm just going to play that for you and then see any comments on this.
DeAndre Campbell, Michael Elligan, Dwayne Christian, just 3 of many Black Canadians involved in use of force cases involving police in Canada.
Sorry, Douglas, I don't hear you sharing your screen.
Each story a tragedy related to...
Sorry about that. Don't know how that happened. I thought I was sharing. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, stop share. Going to be nimble here with my fingers to get to the right thing. All right. Okay, here we go. So yeah, this is the slide. So anti-Indigenous racism. So that's again in your package that I referenced. And then I'm going to go to the video. People can see this. Want to make sure you're seeing this? Yes? Great. So here goes.
DeAndre Campbell, Michael Elligan, Dwayne Christian, just 3 of many Black Canadians involved in use of force cases involving police in Canada. Each one under the age of 30. Each story a tragedy related to hundreds of years of history before Canada was even a nation. In 1834, Canada became the terminus of the Underground Railroad, a secret network that helped bring some 30,000 enslaved men, women, and children from the United States to relative freedom. But freedom did not mean equality. Africville, on the outskirts of Halifax, was a Black community dating back to 1848. For decades, the city of Halifax refused to provide residents clean drinking water. By 1970, the city had relocated all of Africville's residents. Some of them were moved in garbage trucks.
The computer center riot has gained an almost mythical stature as a turning point for race relations in Canada.
In 1969, students at what is now known as Concordia University in Montreal barricaded themselves in a computer room on campus to protest discrimination by a prof against 6 Black students. The legacy of trauma lives on today. When video surfaced of Justin Trudeau in blackface in the 1990s, even the PM admitted he wasn't aware of how racist the act was.
It was something that I didn't think was racist at the time, but now I recognize it was something racist to do, and I am deeply sorry.
What's worse, the myths persist even today. The idea that Canada is somehow immune to widespread racism. Listen to Doug Ford last week.
Thank God that we're different than the United States. And we don't have the systemic, deep roots they have had for years.
And to Quebec Premier François Legault, who was either ignorant of history or chose to ignore it.
I don't
want us to compare ourselves to the United States. We have not experienced slavery in the history of the United States.
Both eventually conceded racism exists, but their comments still reflect a lack of awareness about our own history. Sadly, that comes as no surprise to Andrea Davis, Associate Professor of Black Cultures of the Americas at York University.
I think that our leaders don't really have that excuse of saying, well, I wasn't taught this in school, because it's their responsibility to know the histories of the people they represent. It's their responsibility to know the societies that they represent. And again, if we're going to keep saying that this is a multicultural society, then it's upon us, all of us, to really genuinely seek to know each other.
So thank you for watching that. Again, I'd like to leave some space for any feedback, any comments. So again, in the chat, you can just add any reflections or thoughts you're having as you watch that. And again, I always like to ask people, am I preaching to a choir of people? Oh yeah, I knew all that history. Or is there anyone who's watching some of this going, wait a minute, I didn't know that, that's new to me, you know, or something you had as a reflection as you were watching it about how you're understanding or thinking about Canadian history around the experience of racism in this country or oppression generally. Yes, and as Caitlin has just mentioned, the riots at Concordia, yeah, that last image on the bottom corner of the image with the, you know, Japanese internment, segregated Black school, which by the way, the last segregated Black school in this country closed in the early 2000s in Nova Scotia. So, you know, and again, as somebody who migrated, my family migrated here in the late 70s, that really struck me that I had lived in this country while segregated schools were around me. Still, you know, which I thought as even then I was learning was something that happened in the States a long time ago. So just a kind of interesting piece around that. And then on that same slide, the bottom right is actually images of the students with their hands against the board because they were then protesting the way they were being treated in the university at the time. And again, if there's anything in the chat to comment on, let me know. There's a lot coming in, I'm seeing. Yeah, and thank you for those of you who are saying, yeah, familiar bits, but there's things I still didn't know. And I think it's so important sometimes to understand the breadth of this, because sometimes the story can be, well, in Canada, we're not so bad because yeah, things happened, but not the way that they happen, you know, elsewhere or again, down south. But the reality is that I always want to remind people that the Underground Railroad went in both directions. And one of the people on this chat that I'm happy to see, Rita, because Rita Devlin's done a lot of work around this and knows a lot of this. And I think Rita's adding to the chat some other resources, Sylvia Hamilton's work, for example. So there are lots of actual documentaries and films that exist, but unfortunately have not always been taken up as widely to educate us at large about this kinds of histories. So for example, the Underground Railroad went both directions. People also tried to leave Canada because slavery was here, and people tried to also escape to go to the north of the United States where they thought they'd have a better life. Folks who came from the south across into Canada also came and went, whoa, we thought it's going to be much better. And so they also returned. So, we kind of think of, why on our $10 bill, we've got, the woman who certainly, protested sort of segregation in the movie theaters by, sitting and refusing to move in a way that, when I think of the story, we know the story in the United States, but rarely do we always know these stories here. So just want to be clear that as we're moving forward and continue to talk about what this looks like, about the depth to which and the breadth to which there is this experience here in this country as well. Yeah, and Rita's saying, yeah, of course we don't want to remember and think about that, because some of us want to preserve an idea of the place we live. And I think it's difficult to sometimes stare in the face of what's the reality of what we're experiencing or have experienced here. Because I think what people would argue, and not maybe it's been in the chat so far, is people say here in Canada, it's a bit more subtle, right? Or it's not as in your face. But the argument then is that sometimes can be even much more challenging, because we can be sort of like in environments where we think it's all great and it's all going to be good. And then things are happening around us and to us. And I think, if you ask the questions of many of us who've been targets of oppressive behaviors, that's really what makes it sometimes challenging in Canada. Is it's taken us a long time to have the explicit conversations. It's also a good example in Canada is that it took us a long time to begin to gather data, race-based data. Lots of resistance, certainly also from communities of color, because the concern is, how will it be used? How will that information be used? Will it be used to harm us more than to help us, right? Or to help, illustrate the issues? But there was certainly more of a stronger voice that was saying that we don't need to collect that, right? Because we don't think we're that place, and we don't have those issues in the same way. And so thankfully, we're seeing more of that occurring. So that's just an example of the silence sometimes around what's happening here, not confronting it. To actually have heard the police report in Toronto recently that acknowledged, right, the degree to which they police Black communities really differently was really significant. And there's also acknowledgement also about how trans communities are also engaged with and related to, as we're now here across the country, of Indigenous people's experiences with the various systems that they engage with. And not to mention folks with mental health illnesses who certainly get differential treatment and are often killed more, commonly than, folks who don't have those illnesses, for example. And thank you, Kimberly, the name Viola Desmond, right? Because often I would even say I could tell you the whole story of Rosa Parks, who is the woman in Michigan who sat on the bus. So I even know that term, but it's only more recently, and there's so much more to learn about Viola Desmond, who was a very successful businesswoman who risked everything she had and was even jailed and had to go through a very, offensive court experience because she stood up and challenged, or she at least resisted in what she did. I mean, she literally actually sat down. She didn't sit up, she sat down and resisted. Right? So I don't know, Scott, if I've missed anything else significant you want to?
I don't think so, Douglas. I'm seeing a lot of comments about people knowing a little bit of, aspects of this part of Canada's history, or in some cases, none at all. So I think that having this knowledge brought to the group discussion is really, really, really valuable.
Thank you. All right, it's gonna keep going unless there's any hands raised or other questions. And so anti-Black racism then, and again, this is in your package that gave you a definition, right? And I think we've just talked about, and you've seen in the video again, that historic legacy, and the implications and impact, and certainly sort of patterns in legislation around immigration patterns of who gets let in at what times in what roles, and how people get treated in terms of even their opportunities when they come into this country with, say, training or education that would lend itself to actually taking on certain roles, and then they find that they don't qualify and have to either go through strenuous kinds of studies and so on to qualify, even though we find at some historical times different decisions are made. So for example, now with the difficulty in the nursing, in the healthcare field, looking at sort of things that were restricting people's access, that now they're starting to sort of loosen or soften around some of those things. So, and that's a common experience for people in terms of differential treatment, particularly for racialized people from other parts of the world. So this is the last video that I'm showing you. And this one is made particularly in response to the wide-ranging anti-Asian oppressive experience that was targeted at the community, particularly in relation to the COVID pandemic, with lots of blaming and finger pointing. And so you probably saw a lot of things on the news. And so a group of folks got together and put this together as a response, again, standing firmly in resistance in relation to what's occurring.
We have never been a loud people. Our elders always taught us that actions speak louder than words, so we learned to keep our heads down, keep our grades up, keep our kin close, keep our mouths shut. I wonder what it does to a people when they stay quiet for so long. Do they forget their voice? The sound of their stories, the resilience of language? When you are no longer in your motherland, does your mother tongue still sing of home? What work songs lifted our spirits as we built the railroad? What prayers did we whisper as they sent us to camps in the mountains to meditate on all the ways we don't belong to this country? So we stayed quiet. As they burned our Chinatowns down and spit on our grandmas at bus stops, we stayed quiet. As they laughed in our faces and told us to go back where we came from, but they've mistaken our silence for compliance. Looked on our meekness as weakness. See, we, and not the submissive stereotype that's been depicted, and silence on us, they've gotten it twisted. See, silence is golden, as are we. A gradient of yellow to brown, every Koreatown a little Saigon, an act of defiance. Every hunchbacked elder a humble giant. Silence is grace in the triumph, is peace in the riot. Silence is bold, a force. It is the brewing calm before the coming storm, and now the sky is splitting open and the rage is pouring forth, so this is for every kid who has ever tried to pull their nose bridge to make it taller. Every time they mock us because our eyes are smaller. This is for our elders, both alive and remembered, for their lessons, the tough and the tender. For our full names, past and present, may they be pronounced, may they be respected. For every chink in the national fabric, every nip in the winter wind of prairie towns and northern hamlets coast to coast on stolen land. We are here. We've been here. From takeout joints and internment camps to internships and graduation caps, we are strong. We have pride. We fight. We fall. We rise. And to the ones who say we don't belong, it's them who should open their eyes.
Thank you. Thank you for watching that. And again, any responses? And I see there's a question from Joseph who's asking about how does this history, well, yeah, see the value of it, but how does it reference actually relate to the actor and his craft per se? And so I always, before I respond, any thoughts of others on this as you're watching this content? How does it relate to you folks in your workspaces? What's the value of this information? So I'm seeing Karen, that rallies us to as allies in the hall. Valerie, how our room has been run. Okay, so hopefully, Joseph, you're following along because it's coming pretty fast and furious. And Joseph has those responses. I don't know if that's helpful. Is that helpful to hear that, or? or to read some of these. Alex, craft is a part of culture and has a history. And I would say, Joseph, you know, part of the thing is, again, what I was asking in this very first session is do a foundation. Is to step back a bit and look at, as we started in the second session, dig into, so, okay, what does this mean for the workspaces and the kinds of situations we're in? Is to actually, at this point, step back and look, as people are saying, at what is underneath, how do we understand what might be contributing to some of those conflicts, those issues with each other, where how we strengthen the way we communicate and engage with each other, you know, can occur. And then what are the things that we need to be mindful of or thoughtful of? And just to look at the examples where that communication breaks down, and particularly how it connects to oppression, right? Because it's not just communication for communication's sake, but it's really about how the context of, and because it's quite specific, we're talking about anti-oppressive communication in this case. So it's good to step back and say, well, what do we mean and how we understand oppression to begin with? And yes, the frame here is more looking at, you know, anti-racist pieces, but hopefully people are seeing the links also with wider experiences of oppression as well. I think it might be helpful as we do this next session, and you know, certainly, Joseph, if folks like yourself or anyone else has examples, it would be really, really helpful to bring them into the second session. So again, Joseph, as somebody who posed the question, I always like to see if that helps. Is that helpful or? And thank you for the question, Joseph. It's always good to hear where people are sitting in terms of, you know, because that's the point of the, I mean, this is also communication. You know, you're sitting in something going, wait, I want to understand more clearly how this fits with what we're trying to do and how this moves it forward. And then hopefully you're hearing some things from your colleagues. And thank you, Scott. Yes, and I think maybe, Joseph, what's throwing off is that we're stepping back a bit in terms of framing moving forward. Ah, okay. Hear you, Joseph. So yes, and this is one of the things when I do trainings, generally, I do have members who are like, listen, I could facilitate the session, Doug. And so part of it, though, is when you have other colleagues who may not have the same information, or even just to sort of create the grounding for the conversation moving forward, we want to check in with each other, make sure, are we on the same page? Do we get a sense of the wider context and the frameworks? And how do we understand how that can show up in creating some disconnect, at least in terms of equity issues, that can help us keep moving forward together?
Douglas, there's a question in the Q&A that I'd like to read out, if that's okay,
Sure.
If we have a minute for that. And it's from Dina, Dina Aziz. Thanks, Dina, for sending this in. It says, I find a lot of people feel anxious about engaging in conversations or even asking questions because of A, cancel culture reactions if they stumble or make mistakes, or B, they know they're not supposed to add to emotional labor. They don't know how to confidently advance their own understanding. Do you have any thoughts about strategies for communicating in these sometimes tense conversations?
Well, I think, you know, some of it is really about, you know, as I said earlier, that some of what we're doing in terms of this is not just about a one-on-one piece, it's about what's the environments we have created. And so what are the other resources, right? And who else is in the environment? Because I know, for example, sometimes I'm in an experience and I'm struggling. And so I know having colleagues, other colleagues to go and check in with and check it out with, that can help to advise me, helps me to also come back to the conversation in a particular way, right? I would say I would encourage folks that to still risk, you know, because the thing is, we may get it wrong. We may get feedback that either how we've asked, but you know, as we say, the worst thing to do is to not do anything. It's better to actually take the risk to ask the question, even when it might be received in some of the ways that you're describing, because at least you can keep acknowledging that you're trying to get clearer, and and if there's an apology necessary, and even how you're doing that to do that, but really to stay open in terms of engaging with the ongoing conversation, right? And I would say always, I've had that happen to me myself, where I'm in a dialogue with someone, it's not going well, I step away for a bit and even take some space to check in with some other folks and get some feedback around, how even, and I sometimes have gotten feedback that the way I'm in the experience is problematic, that, and so and it's made me more thoughtful about how I come back and continue to have the conversation. So that's what I would say in this moment, but I think there are probably also some other people responding on the chat as well, right?
That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm just getting a time check. So, okay. So, and the idea here is certainly we have some time between now and in the new year, we have and I think, it's been put in the chat the next time. So it's not the one on November 14th, which is a different session in terms of moving forward. Sorry. And so just some information I think I also sent out in the package, just some statistics on what's happening in terms of, East Asian communities as well in this country. And so just to get to this, and I sent this to you, but again, if you want to have like a framework for kind of how, cycles of oppression work. So really it's saying that, domination of, again, a more powerful group, over others. And then through that domination, there's the use of cultural, economic, physical, psychological, or social threats of force. And then this all then perpetuates misinformation and ignorance, manifests as an explicit ideology, groups of people. And then that becomes its own justification, right? So it's almost, if you think about stereotypes about people, so they're not as smart, they're more violent, right? That then there's a particular way then that it becomes excuse to treat them. And if you think about the doctrine of discovery, which the underpinning was that people who were not following a sort of Christian religion, or people who were seen as savage, either because of their cultural practices, right? And so even one of the things that for many of us who are living in this part of the world, or from heritages in other parts of the world, for particularly brown and black folks, there's lots of those ideas that then show up in the ways that we get policed, in the ways that we get perceived in environments. If you think about even something as a stereotype like the angry black woman, so when a black woman asserts herself, or speaks assertively, or is really clear or insistent or persistent about something, then that gets read and codified in particular ways. The ways in which, I think of young kids who wear hoods, but how particularly if black young boys wear their hoodies, for example. So just to think of those kinds of things that have certain kinds of legacies, right? And then if you think about in your own industry, the histories of the ways that differential experiences have happened in terms of, casting, in terms of even which, things get made and produced, and also in terms of, again, what you're trying to work on, which is to make sure there is more equity in terms of how people experience the kinds of microaggressions that might experience even in the rehearsal halls or the performance spaces as well, right? And so again, you can see that next piece here, which is manifested within organized and institutional structures and programs, as well as within individual thought or behavior patterns. So that's where it starts to move into that wider frame, but also then the specific treatment between the individuals or interactions. And so then this said cycle means that there's a perpetuation of systemic mistreatment of racialized and marginalized people, which then feeds the whole thing, to sort of keep proving itself, in ongoing kinds of ways as well, right? Okay. And so then this piece that I wanted to say, intent versus impact, is so important because and I'm hearing that people are really appreciating this, that we might intend lots of good things, and we don't mean to be oppressive to folks, but our behavior, the ways that we act or interact might be experienced in that way, right? And so, the idea then is to recognize that the ways that, people might experience our actions or behaviors, even when we intend, the best, and again, based on, that historical context, that even if we don't mean to be doing or saying or impacting people in certain ways, they will hear it and potentially hear it and experience, and we may have to explain, and talk a bit more about certainly what our intent was, but also be open to learning about a word that we use. And I'll give you a simple example, which I used the word, the word gypped a lot. And I remember being in an environment where a store clerk gave me the wrong change. And as I was leaving the store with my colleague, I said to them, they were trying to gyp me. And she sort of turned to me and said, did you just say, and in that moment, she made me go, whoa, yes, I just did acknowledge that. And I realized, again, that's residue from, a way that I've used language until I learned about the impact and power of that word in terms of perpetuating a stereotype about people who we now know as the Roma people. Understanding that there's a root to even that stereotype that's based on the fact that people who were Roma weren't allowed to own property or to get certain kinds of jobs, which meant they had to resort to certain ways of surviving that has then, perpetuated a certain idea of who they are, even as that context has shifted and the way that they engage with the world is very different than some of that history. And so, yeah, it's just an example of the kinds of things that will maybe come out of my mouth, maybe in my interactions, that I have to be mindful of. And so here is where then, just to say, how does this show up institutionally, structurally, interpersonally, and internalized in the performing arts industry as a model for the 4 dimensions: institutional, structural, internalized, interpersonal. And so, for example, you see some here on the slide, which is, you could go see, a number of plays at major repertory companies and only see actors of color in silent or servant roles as recently as 2014. Now, don't get me wrong, lots has shifted, but let's be clear that that shifted because of some of this awareness and now that galvanizing of work to really make this change. And again, some companies where you didn't see, I have to say, even just now, my route here in Toronto, when I'm going into the city, is I pass by, I forget what it's called, but it's where the ballets occur, that hall where the ballets occur. And I notice all the ads on the billboards, and I still notice that I think there is maybe one out of a plethora of promotions of ballets to come where I see one racialized presenting person. And so, it's interesting for me also to notice that there certainly is much more diversity and much more possibility, but then you'll see in certain areas and arenas where you still see a lack of that diversity. And so what it means for those of us who engage with those environments, but I also think of then the professionals working in those, professions or those industries, what it means for them, in terms of getting work and getting consistent work and getting work that's not tokenized work, or work that is only when we're telling this particular story. And that's why I have to say I'm excited about Stratford here in Ontario, because I went to part of the season this year. And again, my experience as a consumer, some of you certainly in the industry might have other takes on it, but from the outside looking in, I experience, that casting that is not, seems to be bound by ethnicity in the same way as historically, and some challenging, innovative, talk about dynamic and inspiring kinds of ways of shifting systems and providing, dynamic productions as one example of some of how we can see this move and progress. But again, you all might have different takes on that, right? And again, something that you see about the kinds of things that are available to light, makeup, hair, all those things for Black folks. And then lastly, the one example that's there that, certainly equity has played a role in is there used to be as-cast clauses at repertory companies and in contracts that made actors, take up small or often silent roles without even knowing what they will be. And equity has worked to shift language so that now it's changed to cast by consent. So again, how things can have been what they were not so long ago, that still perpetuated some of these kinds of structures and systems and ways of being experienced by racialized folks, that is starting to shift based on the work of equity. Again, following through on its commitment to certainly making sure that, barriers are removed and there's fairness in the system and the industry. So again, just want to see if there's any comments or. Oh, somebody asked the question, please explain cast by consent. What is that? So maybe if an equity person can explain that.
Sure, I can talk about that a little bit. It's Scott here. So casting by consent is a new clause that we got put into the CTA. We worked with the engagers on this. And basically what it means is that if you're cast in a show, yeah, I'm getting a request to come on camera, which I would love to do. Okay, hi everyone. Casting by consent basically means that quite often some contracts would include, well, you're going to play a certain role, but then you might have to play a couple of smaller other roles to be determined later. What we've done now is we have told the engagers, so we've got it in the contract now, that they must have an idea of everything you're going to be doing in the show, so that for example, if you identify as a racialized artist, you can't be asked out of the blue to, to do something that that could be perceived as harmful to your to you as an artist. And that would include, anything that racializes you on stage, anything that sexualizes you on stage. You have to be given prior notice. And if something comes up as an idea in rehearsal, you have to, yeah, that's a good question, Shell. So you could, well, it would come with the offer, right? You're going to play these roles and they will involve this action, kind of thing. And if something comes up as an idea in rehearsal, they have to have a conversation with you about it, and you have a right to refuse that. That's exactly it, Dina. So people don't get blindsided in rehearsal by things they may be asked to do in a show. And I think that really helps level the playing field in terms of empowering our members in those kinds of situations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. And sorry, and it's helpful. Thank you, Dina. Yes, that term. Again, learning together, right? Dina's put in the chat that blindsided is an ableist term, right? Absolutely. And I think so it's a constant recognizing, again, here we're having the own experience ourselves of how we are navigating a journey where we're unlearning. The word is unlearning. You keep hearing unlearning, because so much, another colleague of mine always says, many of us, whatever age we are now, is how many years we've been in the making. And unfortunately, I think the point I'm making with this, as just to frame our moving forward with this conversation, is about what's been those ingredients in the making of us. That means that I can see in the chat a number of people are talking about the different ways in which they, for example, are being more comfortable with asking questions, being comfortable recognizing that, a lot of our work is relational, and maybe we've not always allowed for what is the experience for somebody else and how we engage with each other. And I noticed also that, Joseph, that's a great example you gave to say, absolutely, and that's the point exactly, is that, but unfortunately, the kinds of language we use and we've learned to use tend to be loaded, not realize that the heritage of those language have been, based on sort of denigration of groups of people. If you think about even, and I'll say this as a very offensive term, and we're using them just to illustrate the point. So you used to hear people say, they try to Jew you down, for example, right? Well, where does that come from? And it perpetuates this idea and the stereotype, again, of Jewish people as somehow trying to rip you off, but as you said, Joseph, we can say lots of things without associating with a group of people or learning or getting feedback that language we use or ways that we're engaging, certainly. And so again, as you asked the question about coming back to the rehearsal hall, right, or to the performance spaces or the craft of what we're doing, it's about, think about that communication, just even to get across a point about a performance or a certain role that someone's playing, for example, and the way those roles are understood. And, and I think we could do a great exercise as well about looking at what are the different kinds of language that we have in our workspaces that probably have heritages that are really problematic, or that we've actually cleaned up or changed, including just that piece that we just talked about an as cast clause, for example, that had lots of assumptions about who then could play what, in what ways, for example, right? See, there's lots of different examples coming. And I think, yeah, absolutely. And Douglas, yes, I would say, yeah, and that's exactly, I think, why we're really unpacking it. And we're really paying attention to the ways that it can be differentially experienced. but also how we take responsibility for, no, we're not using neutral language. I think the assumption sometimes is that, oh, my language is neutral, right? And on occasion, sometimes it's not, right? And it lands in different ways for different people. Right? And so Heather's asked a good question in the chat. Maybe instead of the word blindsided, what's another word that we could use? Anybody have thoughts? And this is how we learn together. And this is how, as folks said, you consult with other folks and, oh, sorry, Heather. Oh, Heather, you're saying you're asking AJ. Okay.
There were some good suggestions in the chat in response to that term, surprised, caught off guard, and I'm writing all those down. Thank you very much.
Taken unawares, oblivious, great. I know, Heather, you asked AJ, but of course the rest of us are thinking now about what else we could be saying. Just surprised. Okay, great. Just mindful of our time, I'm going to move you through a couple of more slides that will, I think, get us set up well for digging in a bit deeper in the next session. So here we have microaggressions, right? So, what we heard here earlier was some terms that are sort of, stereotypical or reinforce prejudices about groups of people. And then you have what we call microaggressions, and you can see some examples here, right? And of course, people, you see the All Lives Matter, and certainly, you've probably, many of you have been aware of the Kanye West situation recently with the White Lives Matter, is all of in line with some of that in terms of understanding context for how we use language. And again, Joseph, your point about isn't all language, certainly, we have to always think about how language, lands for different folks because of context. Context is also the really important piece here. And so defining microaggressions very clearly, I think also sent you this slide. And so it's, the kinds of things that we might even think are, but aren't I complimenting someone? Why are they taking offense? And it's because it might perpetuate in an underhanded way a stereotype. So often it's surprise. So people sometimes say to me, oh, you're so articulate. And I'm going, well, yeah. And again, as a compliment across the board for any and everyone. But where I find it does happen in occasion is it happens in particular ways or moments when I might be around other people who aren't getting the same feedback, even though they are as articulate or as smart. And many of us who are marginalized groups, and women tell this story as well, about if they're in contexts of being traditionally male and environments, if they suddenly show up and are able to function and perform in the same way that traditionally men have in those environments, they get those kinds of feedback as well, right? And so those are some examples of how it can land in certain contexts, in certain kinds of offensive ways for folks, right? And so you'll see at the bottom there, Kevin Nadal, a professor of psychology, he describes it as the, death by 1,000 paper cuts. And I always say microaggression, sometimes for some people is a misnomer, because some of what's seen as a microaggression in a context can feel like a macroaggression. But I would say that I think Kevin captures it well to say it's when you think of those different things accumulating over time in ways that, so many things happen to us when we leave our homes in a day-to-day basis and move around the world, or just in our interactions, that we notice, but we don't make an issue of, because we know we would probably be constantly sort of challenging. And I think when you live in a marginalized body and have a marginalized experience, you're constantly having, the word they use, and sometimes the trauma and challenge of being a part of an oppressed group is that you're regularly preparing yourself and anticipating the potential of discrimination, right? Now, what people will then argue is that, but then it sounds like you're looking for it. Well, no, it's a kind of the way that people have had to survive, because to be caught unawares, right? It's kind of like any of you who are going into, think of people going to a construction site, right? And that's what it feels like for some of us going into the world every day. It's like you're going somewhere where potentially something could fall on your head, right? Or something could, hit you or hurt you. And so when you live in that experience and body, it means that you're constantly having to be noticing what's going on around you. And really, all human beings do that. We all do that in terms of our safety. And so if you live in a world where you've had certain experiences, or you're part of a collective group that has experiences, you can only be understood to be mindful or paying attention. But think of the weight of that, even when it doesn't happen, that you're constantly having to do that. And so microaggressions are the kinds of things that some of us also don't make a big deal of. We hear it, we move on. but it's still having an impact. And so just to give you some examples, and what we're going to do now is a poll. And I think, and again, thank you the folks who are putting in the chat. You're adding some really important pieces there.
Douglas, are we ready to launch the poll?
Yes, let's launch the poll. So again, the poll that you're looking at here that Ilona's put up is, you look at this list of microaggressions, and it was sent to you in the package as well. So if you can respond to this poll based on if you have ever said, thought, or heard these examples. And so you can vote now at any time now. And we'll probably close it in the next 15 seconds. Lona? Poll ended. So we're seeing here 62% out of 47 folks have thought it. 43% of 47 would say they've said them. And at 87% certainly have heard some of these, right? Not saying that all of these, but certainly some of these, right? Okay. So people can see the results here. Yeah, so I think there's an acknowledgement, and I appreciate that people are acknowledging that have thought and may have said these, because of certainly we hear them. And I'm going to acknowledge that I've certainly thought and myself said some of these things over time. And it's about how hopefully some of the content today is really getting us to think about ways that really interrupt, that process of course. And then I'm actually going to move us along to this piece, which is another poll, which is about power and privilege. And so, and again, Ilona, if you're ready again. So with this one, you had the abbreviated knapsack that was sent to you with just those lists of examples of ways that privilege and power exist. And so again, you're going through and, again, questions are if you've ever thought of these areas of privilege before. So one, I've never thought, sorry, one should have been, I have thought. Two, I have never thought. Three, I observe these privileges playing out in our environment or industry spaces. And four, I have never observed any of these. Oh, sorry. Yes, there are three options. Sorry. Yeah, I actually, my fault. I booed on this one. Should have been four, but let's work with the three. So I've never thought. I observe these privileges playing out. or I've never observed any of these. We can probably close this at the in the next couple of seconds, Ilona. Okay, so really the overwhelming is certainly observing them, and that by default, I have never thought. People are saying that they have thought of that. And again, you know, very few people have never observed any of these. So again, just the acknowledgement and the knapsack. I think in the chat, some people are putting a question mark, so we'll probably resend it again, or we might notice that it was sent out in the package for folks. And so just to say, as we're moving to wrapping us up, is that, again, privilege, you know, and again, if you think about communication and the environment, and I think some of you I've seen in the chat been sort of, you know, questioning about what this looks like, is, sorry, just sharing the results there. So just think about how you get to feel at home in the world, how we might escape dangers that others may suffer, and whether we can choose to address certain issues of oppression or injustice. And then think about, you know, whether we've ever had to hide parts of our lifestyle, kind of like the question. So if you think about sexual orientation particularly, or trans experience, you know, those of us who have either had to decide, and even still have to determine as we move around the world where we share information, don't share information. I recently had a colleague of mine send me an email asking me, you know, they're going to, as part of the world that I'm familiar with, and said, you know, I'm going with my partner, should I even do that? And if we go and we are staying in a hotel, should we make sure we have a room with 2 beds and not just 1, even though we usually only choose 1 bed? Because will that expose us to vulnerability, right? And if not, our issues of physical safety, the ways that we'll be treated in undignified ways, for example, right? So, you know, it's just those kinds of examples. And so at this point, then, I'm going to see if there are any further reflections or questions or comments or anything else.
Douglas, there was a question from Sean earlier. Do you have any suggestions how script writers can respectfully write for characters from different genders, races, orientations, etc., to create a diverse cast while also not overstepping and speaking for a community we are not a part of?
I mean, and again, as you ask those questions, I love other people to weigh in. I think of some of the people, skilled people on here who have been weighing in along the way. And I would say, you know, somebody said it earlier in the chat, nothing about us without us. And I think that it's always going to be a challenge for us to do that. I mean, I think that's the journey of experience that we've had. And as skillful as we know some people have done historically at, you know, telling a story, we know that, you know, in today's world, it's rare that there's any writing room that doesn't recognize a need for diversity. Or even if we, and I know people, friends of mine, for example, when they're writing a piece and they're writing in the voice of anyone different than themselves, they always have people from those backgrounds review it, right? And do a read over of it, right? And so, and I see, thank you, Sarah, to make sure even when we're going into those kinds of projects, do we have all the resources? Because the argument would be, should we even do a project like that if we don't have the resourcing to really make it effective or make sense, right? So I would say it's, again, that nothing about us without us. So consultation, or at least making sure people are in the room or part of the process, so that in fact what you come out with, there's different voices. But just to say, that doesn't guarantee that it's going to be, you know, you're not going to still have people give feedback and critique. And I think the thing is also how we get you know, comfortable with the fact that when we put things out in the world, that we're putting out, you know, we're creating work that other people are going to bring their own experiences, their own questions and concerns about it. And so the more that we can do, of course, to strengthen its effectiveness is what we do, but still be open to the fact that we might still have engagement with communities, which is its own dynamic of what it means to create, you know, great work and great art for communities to engage with. And Rita, I see Rita adding some pieces there as well. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Sarah. Sarah's saying a really key piece that it's really from, that's why I was saying, even from the get-go of preparing to do a project and thinking it through, it's really, you know, because yes, the worst is that you get to the end and then you consult folks, but even that can throw you off because you've done so much work, and then to shift and change if you get real significant critiques of the work will then set you back more than if you just started with engaging with folks, you know, to create the production. Sorry, and as we're winding down our last minute, and by the way, I know that there's quite a bit, and that's why we're going to make sure we copy the chat because there's some pieces in there. I know there's some back and forth with some folks around some pieces, so we'll review that and see if we can make sure in the next session we pick up some of those, because I think we want to make sure you don't sort of feel incomplete with how we're engaging if there's some questions that you're interested in also engaging as we move forward. So thank you for that dialogue in the chat, which is really also important. Okay, so I'll stop share. And we're at 4. So I don't know if there's any other questions or comments or feedback or parting comments, statements.
Yeah, there's a lot of thank yous happening in the chat, Douglas. I'd like to express my thanks to you, Douglas. It's always great to have you with us and share your knowledge and experience on these issues. Just going to call up my notes here. I also want to thank our intrepid ASL interpreters, Amanda Hyde and David Kolenda. Thank you so much for your help today. And I want to thank our staff in the background for keeping things together behind the scenes, Ilona and Randy. Thank you so much. And also thanks to everybody who signed up for this. It's great to see so many people taking an interest in these issues. Obviously, we're continuing the work. It moves forward. I feel very hopeful, and I hope that you do too. We will keep gathering and examining and asking questions, and I look forward to the next session. Until then, take care, everybody. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much.